You are listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I'm Kris Van Heuckelom, and in today's episode, I have the privilege and the opportunity to talk to Konrad Klejsa, who has come to us from the University of Łódź, Poland. Professor Klejsa is a film scholar and historian specializing in Polish cinema, film culture under state socialism, and the relationship between film and politics in Central and Eastern Europe at large. Most of his recent research focuses in particular on film distribution, popular cinema, and audience reception in Poland during the second half of the 20th century, the time of the so-called Polish People's Republic. In a recently finished research project, he and his team created an impressive online database of more than 5,000 foreign feature films that were imported into the Polish People's Republic from the mid-1940s up to the late 1980s. We will put the link in the show notes. Konrad Klejsa is the author and editor of many books, a couple of them awarded, and has published widely on post-war film history, both in Polish, English, and German. Recently, he contributed to English-language volumes such as Film Policies in Europe 1945-1980 and the Screen Censorship Companion. And he also conducted research on the Polish communist-era reception of world-class filmmakers such as Ingmar Bergman and Stanley Kubrick. Indicative of his interest in film exhibition culture is his recent contribution to an Oxford University Press book on 16mm film. Welcome to Leuven, Konrad, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation for a conversation on your past and ongoing research. Now, to kick this off, what has sparked your interest in looking at film distribution and exhibition in communist Poland, rather than focusing on specific directors, individual films, or on the state-organized system of film production at large?
Thank you, Kris, for having me here and giving me the opportunity to discuss my research. And of course, each research has its own beginning, and there is a spark always behind something that people do. And actually, I recall quite well how it started. It was 10 years ago, so 2016. And basically, by chance, I watched a film on Netflix. It was entitled Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's a very nice American teen flick from 1980s. I loved this film, but I asked myself a question. How come that I haven't seen that yet? I mean, I'm the film scholar, I'm a film buff. I used to watch heavy loads of movies on VHS, and I never had a chance to see this particular one. So I asked myself, what was the reason behind this, and why I wasn't given a chance to see this particular movie when I was a teenager, when I should have seen this one. So I decided to go to the library and check for the registry of foreign films that were released in Poland. I didn't find out many materials, many books on that subject, but I came across one particular, a bit bizarre registry of foreign films released in People's Poland. The author of this booklet was Grzegorz Balski, former employee of National Film Archive in Warsaw, and I got in touch with him. This booklet was published in 1984, I believe. It was a bizarre undertaking because it was disseminated in a very small print run. I believe it was in 50 copies or so, and it did not resemble an actual volume, right? Because it was rather a self-published booklet. And what Grzegorz Balski did back in 1980s is that he actually printed it on his own typewriter, the collection of almost 4,000 titles. So I've talked to Grzegorz, and we decided to give his project a new life. There were three things that needed to be done. First, there were some flaws in this data that he collected 20 years earlier. So he wanted to make some amendments. Second thing, these were data regarding the period from 1945 till 1980, so the whole decade, the 80s, should be supplemented. And finally, I convinced him that we should make an internet database out of it. You have mentioned this database. It was a time-consuming effort to do so. This was the first time I have worked on this project, and I believe that it may be of some use for future research and for different scholars, because there are different options of browsing through this data. You can check whether any particular film was in fact released or not, but also you can browse particular countries, particular directors. It was a mess, especially when it came to original titles and different alphabets and different variations of particular titles. I received some funding from a National Science Center in Poland, and this was the core of that project, basically to research not only those movies that were released in Poland, but also try to answer the question, what about those that were not released, and what was the reason behind this? So basically this initial question that I had while watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Mm-hmm. Picking up on this, the system of film distribution in Communist Poland was obviously quite different from its counterparts in Western Europe on the other side of the Iron Curtain. A specific feature of the distribution system in People's Poland was a focus on geopolitical proportions. Could you elaborate on that?
Of course, there are significant differences between the way movies are distributed within the capitalist economy, and also on the other hand, in non-democratic countries. On the surface, both systems may look similar, but the difference was in their respective ends. That is, in the capitalist economy, distribution and cinema chains are governed by profitability. In Poland or in other state socialist countries, film culture officials were more concerned with political needs of the day, right? So in both cases, these considerations affected the set of films which were made available to audiences. So in the capitalist economy, we have the film rental company, the cinema owner, and both want to basically gain as much money as it is possible, right? So the cinema owners try to obtain the best titles for their screens and put them in the program at the best hours, right? This premise didn't function similarly in People's Poland, because in Poland those political agendas were of primary importance, and this is this question about geopolitical issues. So after digging through thousands of archival documents, it was evident for me that the government officials in People's Poland were absolutely obsessed by the very fact that any particular film was produced either in the capitalist culture or it stemmed from the state socialist ones. What they did was that they presented data in annual reports in geographical packages, so to say. And thanks to that, some basically failures on flops of particular titles may have been hidden inside this bundle, right? So, for example, they might have been one successful Soviet film, which gained quite a few revenues, but there were also 200 other Soviet films that were basically flops at the box office. The figures that we have from that time are usually divided into 4 different sections: Polish films, Soviet films, films from other state socialist countries, and the 4th column usually is entitled Others. And these others, these were films from Hollywood, from Great Britain, Italy, France, and so on. And of course, when we have this kind of data, we can produce different statistics, and they concern not only film import. If we are discussing film import alone, it is quite easy to spot that there were only 3 consecutive years during the so-called the thaw after Joseph Stalin's death, when the total number of new releases from capitalist countries exceeded the total number of new films from Soviet bloc countries. But this was only between 1958 and 1961. as for the remaining years, it was the first principle of film import policy in Poland that Soviet movies should dominate the screens. But there is yet another factor that can shed some light on the distribution policy, that is the number of prints for particular titles, because you can purchase a title and give it only, for example, 1 or 2 prints, and you can purchase another title and give it a wider distribution, right? In case of People's Poland, it is evident that prints for Soviet films were manufactured in great numbers, and this was a bit unreasonable from the economical viewpoint, right? But it could be explained by a political necessity. And as a result, cinemas were to some extent flooded with Soviet films, but they were screened at unfavorable hours. For example, Monday morning. In the monthly or annual reports, the administrative officers could have shown, look, we had 1,200 screenings of Soviet films, but nobody cared whether anyone attended those screenings. This was basically a must for the cinema to show them, whereas on the Saturday afternoon there was of course some French, Italian, American films, just like in the capitalist economy. So the other case was the case of films from other state socialist countries, let's say Bulgaria, Romania, Cuba, North Korea even. In these cases, only 2 or 3 copies were usually manufactured, and basically it wasn't easy to spot them in the cinema program, which is a bit similar to what we are having today, right? Because nowadays in Poland there is basically 0 chances to watch a Bulgarian film, for example. So nothing really changed. As for the films from capitalist countries, this is something that always fascinates me, is that cinema administrative officers were quite proud of themselves, because from time to time they repeated this phrase that in Poland there is the best cinema programming in the world, because there are so many great films awarded at the global film festivals and so on. But when we looked through the actual data, it became obvious that this was not really the case. Of course, there were, for example, some great Czechoslovakian or Hungarian films, and it may be true that Polish audiences had better chances to see them than, for example, Belgian or Dutch audiences. But on the other hand, there was quite a significant number of films that were awarded either Oscar or Golden Palm at the Cannes Film Festival that didn't make it to Polish screens due to basically censorship. So the very fact whether the film was or wasn't recommended is also a part of the censorship system.
Mm-hmm. You did quite some institutional research. Which bodies were actually responsible for the restrictions regarding film distribution?
There were 2 that are worth mentioning. The first one is a bit bizarre. It was called Film Repertoire Council. It operated through the 50s till the very collapse of the system. And this was the body that gave opinions about foreign movies. What is striking is that this body consisted mainly of film critics. So this was a highbrow committee, so to say. And perhaps this was the reason why Film Repertoire Council was very reluctant to recommend genre movies. For example, if we take a look at the so-called classics of horror cinema, different Frankenstein and Italian giallos and so on, basically none of these movies were allowed to Poland because the first instance, I mean this Repertoire Council, thought that they are not worth it, right? Take Halloween, for instance, a great American horror film. It wasn't really released in Poland, but we do not know what were the actual recommendation of the council, explanations why particular movies were not recommended, but we do have listings of those films. We know which films they had watched because they were privileged society. So basically they had watched Halloween, but they didn't allow others to do that. But it wasn't the final instance, because even if a Film Repertoire Council recommended any particular title to be purchased, there was another body. It was called Main Office for Control of the Press, Publication and Performances. And inside this institution, there was a Department for Performances, which dealt specifically with films, and specifically with foreign films, because films that were of domestic productions, the censorship process occurred at the earlier stages of film producing. So what we know about the process of evaluating foreign films in this Office for Censorship stems from the bulletin that they issued. It was strictly confidential, so it was classified, and only party officials had access to this bulletin. And in this bulletin, we have very extensive explanation why particular film that was recommended by the Film Repertoire Council cannot make it to Polish screens. So there was a tension between those two institutions. Censorship accused, so to say, this Film Repertoire Council of being too liberal. There are several interesting examples of such tension. For example, Film Repertoire Council recommended Easy Rider, but the censorship office said no. 2001 Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, it was a very similar situation. It's a great science fiction movie, but the censorship office claimed that it was, well, American propaganda, because it shows the space race in a very favorable way to the American astronauts, right? So they didn't regard it as a science fiction film, but they treated it as a commentary to the news of the day. And the case of 2001 Space Odyssey may be an interesting one, because ultimately the film was released after 7 years because the political situation changed. In the mid-70s, this space race between USSR and USA weakened. Soviet Union and United States started to collaborate on joint projects in the space. Stanley Kubrick received several awards at the Moscow Film Festival. So these were arguments that convinced the censorship office that, okay, if the Soviets allowed this movie to be screened, why shouldn't we do the same?
A very interesting phenomenon is the emergence of film societies, the so-called film discussion clubs. What kind of role did these societies play within Poland's broader film culture, particularly against a backdrop of state-controlled film distribution?
Right, this was something a bit different. I mean, this was also for the selected group of audiences. In English, it is called Film Society. In Poland, it was called Film Discussion Clubs, because the idea behind it was that after that screening, there was a discussion, which was not always the case. It is a bit mythologized element of history of Polish film culture, but nevertheless, this was an important phenomenon in People's Republic, because in these film societies, audiences had the chance to experience at least some of those films that were not allowed in a standard circulation, so to say, right? So if the film was forbidden by the censorship, even the film club couldn't have screened it. But there were some films that were recommended by Film Repertoire Council, and the censorship agreed that, okay, but only in the film clubs. In these cases, only usually 2 prints were manufactured, and it was not allowed for the clubs to advertise those screenings in daily newspapers. There is a variety of great films that were screened only in film clubs. These are Shadows by John Cassavetes. These are films by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Amarcord by Federico Fellini, some American film noirs, Kiss Me Deadly by Robert Aldrich. So basically these films were allowed to have a very limited circuit. Mainly those film clubs were associated with universities, but some of them were also associated with big factories, very typical of state socialism. This phenomenon lasted up till the end of the system. Let me add to this that there was one very special case when it comes to film clubs. These were film clubs that operated in Gdańsk. This is a port city. They had access to movies which were allowed to be screened during cruises on the ships. When such a ship called at Gdynia port, some hours later, the film club in Gdynia had some new attractive films landed in their vaults. Several films from the James Bond series, films that played on motifs from the Bible. These were not allowed by the communist censorship, of course. But those movies were actually screened in Gdańsk and Gdynia clubs, which was perhaps a bit illegal, but this was a one-time screening. According to the historical accounts, even the censorship officers came to those screenings just to see the film. They did not allow others to watch.
That's really fascinating. Returning to the role of the authorities, were they well informed about the pitfalls of the film import distribution system? Have you managed to find any evidence that they were able to reflect on their actions self-critically?
The system was quite absurd. The objective of the system of film distribution is usually to allow money to flow from distribution, from cinemas, to film production. So this system didn't work. However, I wasn't able to find any single document that would allow me to think that the party officers were self-critical of their actions. To have admitted that film distribution was being carried out in a way that was unacceptable to the audiences, to the masses. And as a result, the system contributed to the economic collapse of the system and the collapse of the cinema chain. This would, of course, have meant compromising the whole cultural policy. This was confirmed by an ironic definition of a state socialism system. This was a very well-known saying in Poland. That is, state socialism is a system that courageously overcomes obstacles which are unknown in any other system. They put a lot of effort in doing censorship, in doing various commissions, and watching over the audiences behind their back, so to say. What are they doing? What should they watch and what they should not watch? But the whole system was very expensive in these administrative procedures, but it didn't work and it collapsed.
I think that's a very well-formulated conclusion of our conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today, Konrad, and the best of luck with your ongoing and new research.
Thank you, Kris.